I want to introduce Steve Wilson. Steve Wilson is a ham from Marin, but he's going to talk to us about NVIS. He's got like a dozen or more years. And I went up there to watch him put his antenna up a couple weeks ago, and I was impressed with what he does. And I think he's going to tell you a lot. So with that, Steve, take it away.
Just real quickly, I'm Steve. It used to be K0CNL years ago. I started out in ham radio in 1952. I've been through a couple of the sunspot cycles. And even in the worst of the sunspot cycle over the last couple of years, we were able to maintain HF communication around Marin County, off to Sacramento, down to Thousand Oaks and other places in Southern California and up into Oregon without really any problem. We ran into, in 4 years, we ran into 2 nights that we couldn't communicate on anything. And that was because we had some kind of big blackout going. But NVIS made it through the storm. And we started doing NVIS probably about 20 years ago. And when I was a kid, the only antenna I could put up was about 20 feet tall. And it was a off-center fed dipole for 40 meters. And I worked the whole country with it. And that was nice from Denver because the rest of the country wasn't all that far away. And I was kind of used to that. And then when I moved out here to the coast, you couldn't hear the East Coast anymore. And then I got involved in races again. And what we were mostly interested in is communicating around the neighborhood. We have a county, as you well know, that has Mount Tam right smack in the middle of it. And so in order to talk to each other, we either have to go around it, which we do with just simplex radio nets on the UHF, VHF, or we can go over the mountain using repeaters, or if they quit, then we're in kind of big trouble unless we can do something else. And the west side of Marin has very little cell coverage, and we run about a good dozen or so public service events over there every year. And it's nice to have some kind of communication that we can get pretty much anywhere in the county. And we have a dozen or so hams that have go boxes with antennas that they can go deploy in the field and usually set up in about 20 minutes to a half an hour and be on the air with batteries and the antenna and everything. And the whole point of NVIS communication is that it's basically straight up and then straight back down again. That's kind of what this logo in the side kind of pretends to indicate. And it's stands for Near Vertical Incidence Skywave. And that means not quite straight up, because if it goes absolutely straight up, coming right back down to the top of your head, you won't get anything. Right. But if you go off a little bit to one side or the other, then you will actually get a signal that will turn around and come back down again. That has some nice advantages. And we'll kind of get into that when we get into propagation. To get the whole thing to work, the first thing you need to do is change your idea about antennas. And an NVIS antenna is counterintuitive. It's low and it's a simple dipole, and it's made to go straight up instead of out to the side. So we'll get into more of that in a minute. The other thing you have to be aware of, and it's unlike VHF, UHF, walkie world, where it's line of sight, and if you see somebody, you can talk to them. The ionosphere has to help out. It has to be up there and be able to refract your signal and make it come back down again. And part of that ionospheric activity, which is, it's a moving target, is the sunspot activity and the radiation we get from the sun every day. And that's another moving target because it keeps changing all the time. And so what we do here in Marin is we meet every week, and we meet on 3 different bands. And it's to see which one of them will effectively communicate around the county so everyone can hear each other. And it's not the same night to night, week to week. And so everybody's kind of used to the idea of being frequency flexible. And you've probably heard of ALE, automatic link establishment. You run into that? Because that's the thing that the military's kind of adopted now, and it's wide range radios and wide range antennas that can be tuned over, say 2 megahertz to 10 megahertz. And they can kind of go anywhere without rechanging the antenna or retuning or anything like that. And it's to be able to pick some kind of a frequency where you can get the message through. And we do it by mostly going from 160 meters to 60 meter, or to 80 rather, 160 to 80 to 60, and occasionally we can get up to 40 and it actually works. We are now in a new sunspot cycle. It's called cycle 25. And I'll show you another chart a little later. But this is from NOAA. They've been keeping records back to 1750 about how many sunspots there are. Because sunspots are easy to see. You just have a little pinhole and project an image on a piece of paper and you can see the sunspots. Not very well, but you can count them enough. And so they've been keeping records of this stuff, thinking it might have something of use and maybe a portent of something great, like the death of the Queen of England or something. And we're now in a surge that is actually well ahead of schedule. And we'll talk about that in a minute. For an antenna, the kind you need for NVIS is one that radiates straight up and you get low to the ground, and dipoles tend to be the easiest and best things to do because you can put one up for $5 probably if you have any scrap wire laying around. And one of the little videos at the end of this that you can look at is how to make an antenna out of garbage. You can take an old 25-foot, 50-foot extension cord, rip off the outside, take the two wires, tie them together, make yourself a dipole in about 10 minutes, and hang it up with a couple of water bottles, and you've got some insulators, and off you go in the field. So you don't have to carry a built antenna with you. You don't have to buy anything either. The other nice thing about it is you can make one whenever you need one and make it for whatever band you like, because a mono band antenna is actually the most efficient. But there are a couple other kinds of antennas that people are using. One is an in-fed half wave, FHW. And with that, if you're feeding it from the end of an antenna, you're feeding it at a voltage point instead of the center of the antenna that's a current point. And you need to make a balun. It's a 49-to-1. It's a 7-turn to 1-turn, or 27-turn to 3-turn balun. And if you just go on and do a Google search for 49-to-1 un, they'll have about 10 different things in there, show you different ways to make them. You can get them as a kit, you can get them as a bought item from DX Engineering or some of the other companies. But what that'll do is give you a multi-band antenna that you feed from the end. Sometimes that's a little easier to erect than a dipole. Inverted V's also work, and they're nice because you only have to have one pole in the center. You can drope your antenna toward the ground on either end. There's a fancier thing called a terminated T2FD. It's a terminated dipole. Barker and Williams makes them for the military, and it's a folded dipole that has a resistor across from the feed point. It's about a 600 ohm resistor, and it absorbs anything that would be reflected back and become an SWR issue. So you get no SWRs over a really wide range, and that allows for that ALE thing we were talking about. So you kind of go anywhere in any frequency and still talk. Some loop antennas work. They've been using them on military vehicles. I'll show you a slide of one of those in a little bit. And they more or less squirt things straight up. There's a couple of things about NVIS signals that are kind of useful, and particularly for the military, in that they're radiating straight up and they don't put out any power off to the sides. So if somebody's tried to DF you and blow you up, they can't find you because there's no energy going off to the sides. And also, if you're in an urban environment, if you're listening, you can't hear your neighbors because you're listening more or less straight up, and the sky waves are coming in, you can hear them fine. But you can reject a whole lot of your neighborhood noise and interference by just having a loop or an NVIS dipole. They both kind of work. What we're after here, the red line is, are you guys familiar with this stuff? You know what these kind of charts mean? This is the radiation pattern of a dipole, the one at the bottom. And you can see that it kind of puts energy out to the sides. That's the red line. And all your energy is going out below 45 degrees or so. And there's nothing, if you look right in the middle where it says -30, right down here at the bottom, there's a null here of -30 to -40 dB, which is a huge amount. And there's absolutely nothing that you can hear going straight up, and there's nothing you can hear, when you're transmitting. You can't put any energy up that way. So with a NVIS dipole, you can get something that's akin to the green line here, in that it takes some of the energy from the sides and lifts it up. It lifts its skirts up on either side so that you don't hear your neighbor's noise and they don't hear you either. And it's also good for things like TBI, if anybody still has that. But this takes all your energy and squirts it up and off to either side, maybe 15, 20 degrees. And that's the hot zone for NVIS communications. Dipole also has another problem, is that off the ends of the dipole, there's a null. And that's also kind of useful if you can orient your antenna someplace to get rid of some of your neighbor's noises. I have a next door neighbor that has a terrible solar system. And what they're doing is chopping up 600 volts at 9 amps in a square wave, and then converting that back down into AC power. And it puts out harmonics all over the place. It's just a mess. And we had them come out and put filters on it. It dropped it down 20 dB, and they thought that was terrific. It's still an S9 signal all over the bands. So it's not good. So I have a loop that I null them out with, and there's some other tricks too, but that's for another time. But with this kind of dipole antenna, you have to worry about the ends. So you have to orient your antenna in such a direction you can talk to the people you want to talk to. When you go to NVIS, those nulls disappear, and you end up with a pretty much circular antenna pattern that goes straight up, so you can talk to everybody. You can hear everybody. So that's a little more useful. We're talking now about skip zones, and the ionosphere up here, which we'll talk about in just a second, moves up and down every day, but you probably experienced this in your car radio over the years, where you could listen to your local signals at night on AM. Remember AM? Yeah, nobody, right? But at night, all of a sudden, the signals would disappear, and the ionosphere would go up, and all of a sudden you can hear KSL in Salt Lake or KOA in Denver, some other stations that are way out there. And then at night, after the night was over, they go away again. And that breathing up and down is a daily cycle of the ionosphere. And what happens when you skip off of the ionosphere with a regular antenna, you hop over things in the middle. So you could talk to maybe Colorado, but you would miss everybody in Arizona and Idaho and places like that. And they couldn't hear you at all. You wouldn't know you were there. Then you could, a little later, you could talk to a little further east, maybe Chicago, maybe back to New York, as the time or the frequency changes, because they're interacting in both dimensions. This one we've already seen, but this is a side view of what's happening with the dipole. It squirts its most energy out about under 45 degrees, so usually about 30, 35. And then the NVIS dipole, again, has all its energy going up. You're familiar, I'm sure, with dipoles. This is just a half-wave dipole, quarter wave on either side. And the point here is that it's down low. The ideal height for a 40-meter dipole is about 16 feet. And it's counterintuitive. You think, nah, that's not going to work. And it works terrific. And you raise it up and it gets worse. The other kind of dipole that works is, well, this is a combination of dipoles. This is a thing called the buddy pole. It was developed for use by the military in Vietnam. And it's a thing that can come apart in pieces. And it is a packable kind of antenna. And it has its own built-in guy wires. The 4 guy wires here, 2 of them belong to an 80-meter dipole. The other 2 belong to a 40-meter dipole. And then this is a little matching unit that goes off to the radio. This is a flat top antenna. It used to be called a ZEP, where you have a single wire going up and across the top. That works pretty well. And you have a certain portion of the antenna here that's going to work as a vertical, and you get horizontal, some horizontal juice out of that. And then the rest of it will be vertical antenna, the up and down kind of radiation. So you get a little bit of both, kind of like you do with an inverted V. You get a little bit of NVIS and a little bit of sort of the function of a regular vertical antenna. The military car you see down here below is using a circular antenna. And what that is the old 18-foot whip wrapped around itself a couple of times. And that is quite functional. It's a very narrow bandwidth is the only problem with those kind of antennas. They're only good for about 10 kc and they have to retune. But they work very nicely. They're low profile. If somebody's trying to find you, you get under trees pretty well with them and that sort of thing. This is an antenna down at the bottom. I don't know if you can see it, but it looks like a step going along the side of the bottom of the car, like just a little stair to get up there. And that's called a luggage rack antenna. And that's what the ICE people use along the border. And it works quite well. this is a really, sorry about the slide, but this is a type of thing you have to make if you want to use an in-fed dipole. And if you get on and Google a 49-to-1 balun, it'll show you how to make it. It's got all the parts, you know, the Mauser parts, and all it is a bunch of turns. It's a 7-to-1 ratio, so you can put one turn on the first part, but it only handles high frequency. So most of these end up being a little more than this. They end up with 3 turns on the primary with a 100 puff cap across it, and then 27 turns around a T240-30 toroid transformer, toroid disc. Those are about $10 from Mauser or Palomar Engineers, DX Engineering. And you just wind your own. It's pretty easy to do. But if you have 3 turns on the front, you have to kind of match it by having 7 times that on the secondary. And then you can stick it on the end of a long wire and off you go. Okay, this is where now we're getting into radio propagation a little bit. And NVIS communications work over an area from roughly 300 miles in a circle out to sometimes maybe 500. It gets further than that occasionally, but not terribly reliable, but it is reliable. And it has no skip zones like we were just talking about. It doesn't skip over anybody on the way to get to Colorado, for instance, and everybody can hear you in between. And it's dynamic in that it is affected by sunspots and propagation. And with a lot of hams, they're already using NVIs and they didn't even know it because they have antennas that are less than a quarter wavelength tall or a half wavelength even. You know, 40-meter dipole, your best height for a horizontal array would be to have it at about 65 feet. And anything less than that, it's going to start folding the edges of that pattern up and making it more and more into a vertical antenna. And we found that you can get these antennas down, it's about 3 feet off the ground, they still work. We had them on some traffic cones at one of our outdoor events, and we were able to talk just fine to Oregon, Washington, places like that. Yeah, as you get under about 15, 16 feet, you start losing a little efficiency. So you lose a dB or 2 for every 5 feet you drop, but it still works. And if you wanted to be sneaky, you could come up with an antenna that nobody could see on your roof, and it worked quite nicely. The dynamic and interactive stuff here really depends on a slight knowledge of astronomy. This is actually kind of fun. Here we have the Earth, good old blue planet, and the sun is shining from our right. And as you can see, it's made the layers here thicker and more dense and closer to the Earth and filling in. If you compare the outer ring here, the F2 layer, to what's happening at night, it's very thin and feeble over here. And during the day, these layers all thicken up, including the dastardly D layer, which is down here closest to the Earth. That's a kind of a bad layer in a way, in that it is counter what we need. With the F2 layer, we're looking at oxygen molecules that are very few and far between, actually. And when the sun shines on them, they get overexcited. When they get overexcited, they have to balance it out by taking on another electron. So you look around for a loose electron and stick them together. And now you have O3 instead of O2. And O3 is ozone. It's a ionized particle at that point. But that last little add-on electron is kind of fragile. And when a radio wave hits that molecule, it can knock that little electron off again. And then that goes and sticks to its neighbor. And then that sticks to its neighbor, and it goes ding, 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 kind of a domino project. And it begins to slow down the process, and it bends the radio signal enough that it come back to Earth. And that's kind of how that stuff works. The D layer, on the other hand, is molecules that are fully formed, and they're more reluctant to give up their little energy layers of electrons floating around the outside. And so what they do is they tend to sop up your signal and eat it. Going up, it hits the E layer, or the F2 layer is what the main one is. And your signal turns around, comes back down, it has to go through that dumb D layer again. And so you get your signal eaten going up and on the return path. Nicely, that when the sun sets, that layer dissipates almost exactly when the sun sets. And so it goes away right after sundown, and it stays gone until morning. So it gets out of the way, and all of a sudden these bands that you couldn't hear anybody on now are blossoming with all these lovely 60 over signals. This is a prettier version of the same thing. These are the F2 layers in the D region. And on one side of the Earth, they're up solid and nice. And the other side, they settle down and disappear. The D region isn't even there on the shadow side, as you can see. The E layer doesn't do a whole lot for propagation. It's mostly the F, and there's two layers, F1 and F2 you hear about. But it's that daily breathing in and out of the ionosphere that keeps changing all the time. Our radio waves that we're doing with NVIS interact with the layers, and they change all the time. Not only that, but the layers are essentially frequency sensitive. So that's a bit of a trick. Where you have a long, low frequency signal, you can get something that'll talk, quite a good ways around the Earth. And this is another example of a kind of a long signal. This would be like 20 meters going all the way to just about the other side of the Earth. And then maybe 40 meters, not quite so long. But if you go too far up in frequency, you'll get a signal that just goes right on through and just keeps on going. You get no skip at all. And what we've been doing lately is using the FT8 frequency. Everybody familiar with FT8? It's a digital signal. It's on 074, like 14074, for instance. You land on the frequency, it's this hideous screech. But if you get the JS8 software or the FT8 software, you'll realize that there, on that one frequency, there may be 25 simultaneous conversations. It's a wonderful use of the bandwidth, and it's surprisingly good. And so you can get 25 different conversations going on there. Your computer will pick them up and sort them out 20 dB down into the noise, 20 dB down further than you could possibly hear with your ears. So it's really a useful tool for NVI, not only NVIS, but it's also good for disaster services. And that's kind of what we do with most of our digital stuff, is we use FT8 or we've been using JS8 call because it has a bigger payload. You put more stuff with it and you can do WinLink with it and that sort of thing. This is, again, the layers we were talking about, and this is a kind of example of what happens at different frequencies. 80 reflects pretty quickly, 60 doesn't reflect quite as quickly, so it goes further, and the angle is changing so that the longer skip is, in this case, 20 meters. Now you could, up here someplace would be 15 meters and 10 meters, maybe even 6. 6 has actually been active lately. That's just the skywave, different frequencies. We've already seen all that stuff. This is what we're after. Straight up and straight back down again. Not very romantic, but it talks to everybody in your local county or around the Bay Area. The military likes it because if you're trapped in the mountains, you can't hear each other. And that's actually where this got discovered, is that in the World War II, the Germans were in mountainous territory in Switzerland, places like that. And they were communicating just fine to each other, and we couldn't figure out why, because all our trucks had vertical antennas on them, and we were talking to the worms in the adjacent hillsides. Worm warming is what it was called. And this is cloud warming here. When you squirt your signal straight up, it warms the clouds, come down in the next valley, the next one to it, and so on. And so they were able to maintain tactical communications when the Allied forces couldn't do it. And they didn't figure it out until after the war. But if you've ever seen pictures of any of the command vehicles or tanks or things, they have these kind of bars over the top of it. It looks like somebody made like mosquito netting rack. It's kind of what everybody thought it was. It was a rack to hold up canvas or some kind of torn up shreds of cloth that were used as camouflage. So they could hide in the trees with camouflage netting. Nobody could see them. Well, it turned out that was actually the antenna. And it was going straight up and straight back down again. They could all talk to each other. Everybody was happy. And there's a lot of this stuff. I'm not going to go into the complexities of this, but this is on here in case you want to go back and read into it. And this is a part of a Rode and Schwartz tutorial in HF communications. It's excellent. And I've got the link to that at the end of the talk here. This is an attempt to kind of keep up with the NVIS activity. And there's a daily scanning of the entire Earth's atmosphere, and it goes on all the time. And it tells you where you're going to be able to talk, essentially. So if you want to talk here to here, you could do it, but you would have to do it on 10 megahertz, for instance. If you wanted to talk from over here to over here, they're both in the purples, so you'd have to drop down to maybe 2 megahertz. And this is a daily and hourly updated thing from I guess it's government-sponsored Australian website, and you can tie into it if you want to, just to see what it's like. We've already talked about this. That's the wrong one anyway. But let's look at the sun now and what it does to influence the ionosphere that we have to depend on. And you can't depend on it without knowing what the sun's up to. There's daily and hourly variations. You can sit there and watch the sun in real time now because they have SOHO observatories, solar observatory, and you can sit there and watch it. And all of a sudden, this huge flare will come out, and that's great. You've got 8 minutes to do something, because when a solar flare happens, it creates plasma, and that blows molecules all to pieces. And so the electrons that have no mass can get here in about 8 minutes. It's 93,000 miles, and they can get here. They have the universal speed of light, so they can get here in 8 minutes. The rest of the molecule, the protons, neutrons, come lumbering along at much less than the speed of light. It takes them about 3 days to get here. So we can see the electron hit, pow, in 8 minutes, and we know that something's coming. A lot of these satellite users can turn the satellite around so that the armored end of it's pointing toward the sun for a while. And that protects them. And it gives them a little while to do that. They have a couple of days, really. And then we know that something's going to happen. The electrons get here and let us know that now we're going to be blasted with something. It could be a coronal mass ejection. That's what a CME is down here. And that's when the sun blows a piece of itself off, and it blows them off anywhere. It could be away from us, off to the left, off to right, up and down. And every once in a while you get one that's kind of aimed right at us, or a little off to the left, which is the east limb, and it's rotating from the left side over to the right. And if you get one that's sort of a quarter way over to the left side, it's going to squirt right at us, because the sun is turning as we watch it every day. It goes around a 21, 27-day cycle. And it's turning, so the ejection that comes off of the sun works like a lawn sprinkler, and it's this long kind of whip-shaped wave that passes out into space. And so it'll start here, and by the time it gets to us, the sun will have moved a little bit, and then we'll get hit by it. And the thing that we watch for is what they call a full coronal mass ejection. And it's when one of these flares goes off, and you see it going off to all sides of the sun in equal amount. If it's off to one side, we know it's going to miss us. But if it's a pure circular halo, then we know we're in for it for a while. And that's when we get all sorts of electromagnetic interference. One way you can keep an eye on the sun, and I don't know if I can move this, is your menu, or is that just mine that's moving around? Can you see that? No? Okay, well, this is, what I want you to see is the top of this slide, and this thing's getting away from moving, but it's solarham.net. It's by VE3EN, and it's a daily net that takes all of the information that's downloaded from all the different sources all over the world and puts them all kind of in one place. So you can see what the sun is up to at a given moment. And right today, we have a solar flux index of 152, and that is not quite the highest we've had in this part of the solar cycle, but it's, I think we went up to 165 one day. During the years of the doldrums, we had no sunspots, almost 2 years of no sunspots at all. The solar flux ended up at about 60, 68 was a real common daily figure for that. And then the sunspot number, which is SSN, that's the number of sunspots that are up there, kind of a weird way to measure it. But the first is the number of sunspots or groups, and the number of sunspots in those groups. But as this goes up, there's a correlation between the output of the sun and the solar flux index. The solar flux index is done by WWV in Boulder, Colorado is one of them. And they take a UHF signal or actually microwave signal, 1.2 megahertz, squirt straight up and see how high it can go before it has to turn around, come back, or stops. They can't see it anymore. And that gives them an index of the relative density of the ionosphere, if that makes sense. The higher the density, the better the ionosphere is going to work, the better that E layer will be. It'll be fatter and thicker and more able to bounce signals back to the Earth from whence they came. Anyway, those are two real important numbers. The other one is hiding under the little WWV here. And WWV is a radio station, the time and frequency in Boulder, Colorado, or in Hawaii. And you click on that and it'll give you the K index and the A index. And those are indexes of the geomagnetic field activity of the Earth. So you can kind of keep track of that. That interacts with NVIS communication as well. There's a lot of other things besides the gorgeous pictures of the sun up here at the top. There's a real nice flare. And this is just around the corner. We have a satellite that is off to the side, trails the Earth around our orbit, and it's off to about 15 degrees or so off to the left. And we can see things before they happen. It's like we have a little mirror there that we can see around the corner and see what's happening on the other side of the sun. And we have some pretty decent, powerful flares out there. The other thing you see down here is this is a sunspot group, and there's another one over here. They all have numbers, so you can keep track of them as they go around to the other side of the sun. This is an auroral thing that just shows you how big the aurora is around the North Pole. You can also get the South Pole if you want to see that. And there are some people that are aurora hunters who go out and take pictures of beautiful pictures of auroras, and they like that. But a lot of hams that use the auroras to bounce signals off into downtown Europe. So that's interesting to a whole lot of people. And this is another thing that we've been going through lately. This is called a DRAT. And the D layer is that low one I was talking about. And it's an absorbative layer that corresponds to the sun. Now the sun is kind of off coast now. And so it's beginning, it drags a little bit behind the sun. But as the sun moves across the Earth, this blob of D layer activity starts moving along with it. And we're still not in the clear here. So we're up to about 14 megahertz. It's absorbing some of the signal on 14 megahertz, not too much. It's only about a 5 dB degradation. But if you get down to 160 meters, there's a 30 dB degradation in your signal quality. And that's what this is over here. This shows you at the different frequencies, and this is how much is getting absorbed by that layer. So if we were on 10 meters, we'd be losing at least 5 or 6 dB of signal power. And that's updated every 10 minutes, I think. Pretty quick anyway, but this is a good way to find out what's going on out there and where that D layer is. Sometimes it goes away entirely. And we've had a lot of that, but now that the sun's active again, it's becoming more and more interesting. This is where we are with the new sunspot cycle. A little while ago, we were kind of ahead of schedule, and it's gotten even better. As you can see here, we're up to the solar flux index, which is the first number we were talking about, is well ahead. And this is the number of sunspots, the sun SSN over here, sunspot number. And it's well ahead of predicted. The red line here is the predicted curve. So it's not even supposed to get good until maybe, 2025, but it's already there. So we've got a really interesting, extra good sunspot cycle coming up. And that's fun to realize. But the bands have opened, the HF bands have opened prematurely, and not a lot of people know about it yet. So the bands aren't crowded, but eventually they will be. We'll likely for parking in San Francisco. This is a chart that you can get from WWV, and it just explains the geometric A and K indexes. The K index is a 1 to 9. It's a logarithmic, and the A index is just a number up to 400, as high as I've ever seen it. And what that is, it talks about the geomagnetic field getting jumbled up. And when the Earth gets hit by a bunch of radiation of ions, they're pretty powerful and they can affect magnetic field. And so what they do is push the magnetic field out kind of like a comet's tail, and it'll come bouncing back in, and then it concentrates around the poles. And that's what gives us the auroras. And a lot of people rely on the K&A index to figure out what propagation is going to be on 20 meters, for instance. That's better for DX. It does affect somewhat the NVIS stuff on the lower frequencies. This is a new participant in the field of space weather. Her name is Timothy Skov, and she has a website and a regular weekly broadcast of space weather. And she's kind of fun and entertaining to listen to. And she knows a lot of stuff. And she takes things from all the weather channels and puts it all together into, a human presentation that's really kind of fun. Another place for weather stuff is the Space Weather Center at National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, again in Boulder, and it's got all sorts of things about auroras, coronal mass ejections, magnetospheres, ionospheres, all this kind of stuff. There's a ton of things to discover. This is what we do in Marin County for frequency selection. We usually have 3 bands going, and during the winter, we found that 60 meters didn't work, 40 meters didn't work. The only thing that did work most of the time was 80. And then occasionally we had to go down to 160 meters, and found that was kind of difficult for people, because on a city lot, getting an antenna, a horizontal antenna, to work on 160 is really tough. Vertical antennas are a little easier, but they don't do the same thing. And I've got some friends that are up near the Oregon border, and we can talk back and forth like we're sitting next to each other on 160 meters, but it's been really hard for other people in the county to get an antenna up that shows any sign of promise. Our best band so far has been 80 meters. And during the day, we can usually move up to 5405, which is our daytime frequency. And occasionally we've been able to get 40 meters to work, and 7228 is our voice frequency. We have another one there. It's on 7083. And that's for US upper sideband digital JS8 call. And we have a weekly net that we talk back and forth and see how many people we get to sign in on that. That is an excellent thing to have as backup for emergency work, because if you have something like a list of Polish refugees, for instance, or Ukrainians with strange spelling names, trying to get those across verbally would take you the rest of a week. But with being able to type them out and send them, it's huge convenience. That and other things that are complicated names that don't make any sense, like medicine and exact dosages and things like that. If you had to send that, that's really tough to do by voice. So it's nice to have a digital backup. And the winter plan is a little different from the summer plan, because the bands are more active. The ionosphere it's more thoroughly condensed and thicker and further down. So at nighttime, 160 still works. It's open all day, all night, every time, but there's so much noise that it's becoming less interesting. You have to do some tricks on 160 meters, set up loop antennas, noise canceling arrays, and that sort of thing, and get it to work, but you can do it. Our main frequency again is our 3895. During the day, we can get on 5405, and we usually have to compete with the guys in Sacramento and other places around the country. And there's a bunch of guys up around the Oregon border that talk. And in an emergency, they'd be cool with us taking over the frequency. That's not a problem. But anyway, this is here for you. And if you want to come and join us sometime, please do. And this is a page of links to get you started. And if you've had, I would guess that to be about the average adult dose of NVIS technology for the normal human beings. But if you want to continue, there's a Roden Schwartz YouTube 20-minute video that goes through pretty much what we've been saying, but a lot more detail. I tried to keep this as simple as I could, so you have a kind of basic overview of what to expect when you start looking at some of these other things. They'll make a lot more sense to you, I should think, now. And that should do it. Now, who do we miss? Do you have any questions? Anybody left? Everybody went to sleep. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I don't have a question, just a comment. I'm glad to see they talk about solar activity, but they're still using the 7-year sunspot cycle, basically.
It's an 11-year cycle.
11 years?
Yeah, from peak to peak, it's 11 years.
Oh, okay.
And we've been through a period of about 3 or 4 years where there were no sunspots, and people were giving up the HF bands for good in some cases, and just thinking it was a bad idea. Nothing would ever work. There was never anybody home. But with that FT8 that I was talking about, you can get people all over the world talking, because they all are on one frequency, which is kind of rare, normal ham radio. But by listening to it, you can not only tell that the band is alive, but you can also tell where the signals are coming from. So you can get a good idea what the footprint is on the other end from where you would be if you get on. And then all you have to do is go down the band a bit to the CW band, call CQ, or go up to the sideband area and start calling CQ there, because you know the band's alive. A lot of people don't know it because it's just sitting there. It's a flat line on your screen if you're watching it. And all of a sudden the signal pops up and it's 20 over 9 and it's, New Mexico or China or, South Africa.
Yeah, I used to use the 2-element beam most of the time and bounced off the ionosphere, and you never knew where in the world you were going to talk to.
Yeah, that's the fun part of ham radio for DXing anyway. You never know quite what you're going to get. And so
I know, it's fun. That was the fun
always
part.
a surprise. Yeah. I was working on a radio in the middle of the night when I was a kid. The 10-meter band had gone dead. There was nobody around, and I was trying to put an amp together or do something. And I said test 1, 2, and all right, what's going on there, mate? A guy from Australia came back and he sounded like he was in a room with me. Scared me to death. But that was the dead of night on 10 meters.
Yeah. You just go to some empty spot in the band and call CQ and see what happens.
Yeah, it's it. Nobody puts a quarter in the jukebox anymore. You can get in there and send out a CQ or two.
Right.
Go ahead.
If you get JS8 or FT8, it's JS8X, I think is what it is. It's Joe Taylor's digital mode, FT8. And if you get it, it's got different frequencies for each band that are allocated to that one frequency that they all foregather. And if you get on that frequency, you can tell whether the band is open. So you just set your radio to 10 meters to 15 meters to 20 meters to 40 meters to 80 meters and go punch, 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 punch. And all of a sudden, as you're coming down in frequency, all of a sudden this squawk will break out and you know that's a band that's open. And you go above it and it's quiet. It's not that there's anybody there. Sometimes if you tune onto a band that there's absolutely silent as far as you can tell, you listen to the FT8 and all of a sudden a whole bunch of things will start printing out of the noise that you can't even tell there's a signal in there. So it's a pretty remarkable medium. It's part of the whisper thing, though, with the really weak signal propagation.
Because it's funny, you can be sitting there, you pick a spot on the band and there's nobody there. Well, somebody else in the world is sitting at the same spot and say, gee, there's nobody on.
Yeah.
Until one of you calls CQ and then, ooh.
Oh, there's Janet.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh.
That was more fun.
Yeah,
Malcolm, I see you have a question.
I do. For a while in the Army, I was a Track 80 operator as a microwave communications with a big antenna. Great. But most of it, we used tropospheric scatter. So,
right.
And this, by the way, this is a great presentation. I've loved every minute of it.
Well, thank you.
So because it's microwave, if we aim the antenna, because we could aim the antenna straight up, judging by your slides, that signal would have just gone straight out of Earth's atmosphere entirely.
Yes.
But of the low angle, so do different frequencies bounce off different layers of the atmosphere?
Yes, they definitely do. And they use a microwave to determine the height of the ionosphere. That's that's the WWV sunspot number that they use. And they do it actually a bunch of places around the world, and then they average them together. But it's a way to tell what's happening with the ionosphere. And mostly with microwave and UHF, VHF, they are not very good at being bounced back off the ionosphere because it seldom, if ever, gets to the point where you could actually refract a signal. Once in a while, 60 meters will actually open up. And it's kind of like the miracle band. Oh, it's open, and everybody celebrates. But that's 50 megahertz. And that's kind of a rare event to have the ionosphere be able to support communications, or at least a return of communications on that frequency.
Thanks.
So, Steve, I have a question.
Sure.
So let's say I wanna set up the club to go out and practice this.
Mhm.
And I want to do it at 11 o'clock in the morning, just, without really, maybe do it often. What height, what length and what height should I try? I mean, should it be 40 meters, 80 meters? I mean, where would you start?
Well, that's a tough question to answer with a simple answer, because
Okay.
it's what happens at 6 o'clock in the morning, you're going to have one kind of ionosphere. At 8, it's going to be different. 10, it'll be different. Noon, it'll be different. It'll still be building up in intensity until about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and then it starts to fade again. And when it gets into a peak of the middle of the day right now, and this is kind of the peak of the summer season, you could probably get 40 meters to work. But barring that, you probably want to go down to 60 meters. And if that doesn't work, then you go down to 80.
So if I would I want to maybe set up an 80 meter, let's see. So a quarter wave for 80 meters, that's about 120 feet.
Yes. What I would recommend, actually, if you want to do that, is to do a multi-purpose dipole by not
Okay.
having it tuned to 80 meters, but tune it something in the middle between 80 and 60, for instance, to
Okay.
about 4.5 megahertz. And then feed the center of the dipole with ladder line that's lossless and have that come down to a tuner, and then feed the tuner with coax.
Okay.
You put the tuner at the base of the antenna. I don't know if you noticed in that one thing where they had the military antenna with the 2 dipoles with the box on the ground. That was a tuner. And what that does is if the antenna is too short, it kind of adds in some of the feed line
Okay.
to make it work. And if it's too long, the stuff, part of the antenna or the wave will go down into the ladder line, the 450 ohm ladder line. And with antennas, the outer ends of the antennas are always a voltage point. You can count on that.
Right.
And then as you go back a quarter of a wavelength, you'll get to a peak of where the current is. And that's what's happening in the middle of a dipole. That's where all the current is. And that's the stuff that actually radiates. The voltage at the end doesn't do anything. It just makes it pull, it helps to pull the current up into the antenna.
So would you go with a end fed first or a center dipole?
I think I'd prefer the center dipole. I've got one that I have about 30 or 40 feet of ladder line on it. And if there's a mismatch, it goes down into the ladder line that's lossless. And if you have it go into coax, coax can't perform at anything other than 52 ohms.
Right.
So you'll get a terrific loss if you have like a 3,000 ohm impedance or something going into coax. It just forget it. Nothing will get out the other end. But if you feed your dipole with a tuner, and then the tuner with coax that goes back to your radio. So between the tuner and the radio, you have a perfect 52 ohm transfer. You'll get all your power that gets out to the tuner, and then it'll take all that power and then try to put it all into the antenna from there.
So it would be dipole, ladder line, tuner to the radio.
Yeah, exactly.
With coax.
Yeah, that's one you can try all 3 bands with.
Okay.
You can get on 80, 60, or 40, and you can tune it up to 15 meters and 20 meters if you want to. You end up with a pattern that has multiple lobes on it, but it still works.
Okay. But is it sufficiently efficient?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. As long as you're not getting a huge mismatch in the coax itself.
Yeah.
And that's what that in-fed thing is about. What it's trying to do is take 52 ohms and match it to probably a 4,000 ohm load that you would get on the end of a dipole, or the end of a long wire, I should say. And that's kind of asking for trouble, because it's all frequency sensitive. So it might work great on 20 meters and won't work on 40. It might work indifferently on 60, and all of a sudden it's gangbusters on 80 or something. So you're playing around with kind of a mismatch gambling, I guess, for lack of a better term. And it's not something you control. But if you have a tuner, a little automatic tuner like an SGCC, 235 or 239, something like that. They make little waterproof tuners. And you have a little battery that you go out and sit at the base of the antenna and then feed the whole thing with coax. And then the automatic tuner will figure out what the best match is. It switches in little lumps of inductance and little chunks of capacitance. And it ties them together and figures the right combination to give you like a 1-to-1 or 1.12 or so to one match. And then if you change frequency, it'll do it again. It'll go ticky, 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 ticky until it figures out the right match. And then all of a sudden it goes thunk and it's there. So you go back to the first frequency and you hit the key and it goes thunk because it remembered what the settings were. And so the second time around, it's instant. So if you go to your 3 bands you're going to talk on, do a tune, 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 it remembers them, and then you can switch just instantly from any band to the other. And it makes it really easy to maintain constant communications.
Okay, so I understand that the height can be best at quarter wave to a 10th wave.
Well, it's 0.2 to 0.1 wave, sort of the formula for NVIS.
Okay, I was reading it as a quarter down to a 10th of a wave. I'm reading a book by a couple of colonels who done things. I don't know their names. I haven't memorized that. But with that in mind, so if you put up this 80, or is it? I think are we going to put up an 80 or 120? 80?
Well, I wouldn't go to 160. That's a real long antenna.
Okay, so we put up the 80. Do we? Is it going to be too high when it's at 40?
No.
Okay.
The vertical height off the ground, it works better the closer you get to the ground.
Correct.
Until you start getting really ridiculous, like under 5 feet or something. It
Right.
still works. You're going to lose some of your power that way. It's just less efficient.
Okay.
But an average height of about 25 feet would be good for 80. 16 feet is good for 40. And so somewhere in the neighborhood of 16 to 25 feet, somewhere in that range, you'll get an antenna to work on both bands.
Okay, but all right.
All 3, actually.
All 3 is what I was wondering.
Yeah, you guys use 60 meters?
Not often.
Well, we started out with a real thin group of about 2 or 3 of us, and now we've got as many people on 60 meters as we had on 80, which is about 20 every week. And it's gotten to the point where they figured out either how to tune a multi-band antenna or put up one for that band. But it's a good one. And we also have there's one frequency that's for digital traffic and another for DX. And there's only 5. They're channelized, and it's only 5 frequencies, so it takes a little figuring out. But it's worth it in an emergency. It's an open, very easily propagated type of frequency.
Okay. Well, good. And are there other questions for Steve this evening? I've got to go and take a look and see. Change the gallery setting here. See what's up.
And that was very informative. Thank you very much.
Well, you're most welcome. And it's been a little secret that nobody's paid any attention to. It took us about, I don't know, 10 years of fiddling around with it to get it kind of figured out. But it's actually, once you got it figured out, it's pretty simple.
And it seems to me that the beauty of this is that you can get close communications close by in a very hilly area.
Yes.
Which is perfect. I mean, San Bruno, all we have is canyons and
It's why it's perfect for you guys. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's why we have Mount Tam right in the middle of the county, and we either have to talk over it or around it. And so it's become a necessity.
There we go. Now I've got everybody back. So any other questions? I want to thank Steve. I mean, that was a really good program. Matthew, are you wait?
Yeah, I just had a quick question. Just thinking about your 0.2 meter, 0.2%. Was that correct? So a 40 meter signal, 2/10 of 40 meters is what about 8 meters, which is already 24, 25 feet.
Right.
Right now, some people some people who have horizontal antennas, you know, even if they want to go long distance, can't get them up that high.
That's true. So it works below that. You can go up 8 feet with a 40-meter dipole and do just fine.
I understand that. I guess what I'm saying is that people who are doing normal DX might have an antenna 20 feet in the air. And then in effect, they're getting both. They're getting their lobes going out at a 45-degree angle and also a considerable amount of energy going straight up.
Well, what happens is the pattern begins to fold up as you get closer to the Earth. And so you start getting some radiation. It may not be all the way, but if you put a wire underneath your antenna, you can add another ground wire underneath. And then, particularly if you have ground that's not very conductive, it helps to kind of squirt things up. It's like a reflector.
I wondered about that, what the Earth effect would be. So if you water your ground, you're better. If you have any water.
Yep. And if we get water ever again.
Right. All right, well, thank you. It was a great presentation, Steve. Appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to do it for you guys. Hope to hear you on NVIS.
We're going to see if we can give it a try one of these days.
Please do. We're there every week on Tuesday night. You have our schedule at the end. Tuesday night at 6 o'clock. We're on 3895. And then we go to 5405 at 5 minutes after 6. We just do a real quick check-in to see who we can hear. And then we go up to 40 meters to 7083 for the JS8 call digital session. And then if we can talk to each other, the digital thing, the JS8 gives you a signal to noise ratio report. So if you hear somebody and they're minus 10, it means they're 10 dB down in the noise. So you can't probably talk to them. But if you get something in the plus range, all of a sudden those are people you could go up a little further in the band and just talk to. So we kind of use the JS8 call software as kind of a can opener to see if a band's ready to go. And if it's not, we can still communicate. But you can communicate a great deal longer with the digital software than you can by voice.
Okay. Tuesday evenings. All right, make a note. All right. Anybody else with a question? Steve, with that, I don't see anybody else because I think you did such a good job that you've kind of wrung all the questions that they might have had out. So,
well, if you want more detail, and not that anybody probably like me to, but there's a lot more online. When I first started this, there were about 2 videos on NVIS. Now there's hundreds. So there's lots of good stuff out there. And I put a few things at the end. There should be another. Oh, there it is. It's this last piece of paper. Yeah, these are different links to find out stuff that we have covered, but much more in detail. The very first one is the Rode and Schwartz. They make military radios, and they did a really nice presentation. I think it's a dozen or more chapters that are on HF communications and military use and that sort of thing. But the one on HF antennas, there's one I think it's specific for NVIS, and it's well put together, and I think it's about 20 minutes long per section, but you can get a heck of an education just on that one website.
I have a question.
Sure.
Turnstile antennas.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of those?
Well, that's kind of what that one, with the 4 wires, that's the simplest form of a turnstile. But what they did is they have one set of wires tuned for 80 meters, another set right angles for 40 meters, so they don't interact with each other. And you could add another one in between for 60 meters if you wanted to. And the reason for getting a tuned antenna is that you don't have to have a tuner. So it's a little cheaper to do that. You just tune the antenna and off you go. And one of the things we were talking about when we did the presentation the other day was how can you, if you were out in the field and you had your radio and a battery, but no antenna, you could make one out of an extension cord or a piece of fence wire. You can unwire, anything that has wire wrapped around it, like the wire on the end of a broom. We pulled enough off of that to make a 40-meter dipole. And there's all sorts of just stuff around. There's this wire that all you have to do is unwind it, and you've got something to work with. And then trying to figure out without a measuring tape how do you figure out what kind of a length of an antenna to do, say, 40 meters? And there's a formula for that. It's called the 2468 rule. And 246 is the number that you divide by the frequency in megahertz to get the feet that it takes for a single antenna, like a half of a dipole. And if you go up just two more from that, it's 468 that follow in sequence. That's the formula that you divide by your frequency in megahertz to give you a half wave dipole. So when the 246 is for a quarter wave, and the 468 is for a half wave. So you can do that pretty much in your head. And if you figure that out, it's about 32 feet on the side for a 40 meter antenna. Now, how do you get 32 feet? If you're all by yourself out in the middle of nowhere, you don't have a ruler, how do you figure out where 32 feet is? And it's something that's handy to know. And you can put one foot in front of the other and step that way, but nobody knows how far it takes to go through 30 feet. Yeah, you can do that and get close, or you can take a stride and do roughly 2 feet. But if you're going to shoot for an antenna, you want to go a little longer than you need, and then tune it back by cutting the end of it off.
It depends on how tall you are and how big your feet are too.
Of course, yeah, and that's a human variability. Your wingspan from, when your arms are completely outstretched should be the same as your height. But during COVID, I lost 3 inches in vertical height, so I don't know what the heck it is anymore. So I'm shriveling.
And that happens the older you get too, you lose
Yeah,
that.
it's sad, but more efficient, I suppose.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Appreciate the invitation, and we'll be looking for you on the air.
Thanks.
Thanks so
Steve,
much.
thank you very much.
You're
Okay.
highly welcome.